Welcome to the Everybody Matters podcast. This show is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. Don't forget to connect with us on the web at barry-wehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stuart, your host. Welcome to part 2 of our series on higher purpose in business. I want to start off this episode with Strecher, a professor at the University of Michigan and author of the book, Life on Purpose, How Living for What Matters Most Changes Everything, as he talks about why there is a need for a higher purpose in business and why this is a conversation we are having right now.
I think that meaning and purpose are so important right now because in some ways I think our whole society is starting to lose it. It's losing its direction. It's starting to focus so much on what Kim Kardashian might be doing or what the latest social media events might be going on. And there's such a focus now on material goods, on objects. I think people are feeling pretty empty from that, honestly. And you could also say maybe people are not going to church or synagogue or, their various religions as much as they used to. This might be called modernization, I'm not sure, and I have no judgment about that. But the point is that with the loss of that, we also have this problem with purpose, with a direction. So what do we do now? And so I do believe that there are wonderful directions, transcending directions that people can take in finding a very strong purpose in their lives, whether they have religion or they don't have religion. I really think that businesses that allow people to craft their purposes, so what we often call job crafting, is so important. So you could have a custodian at a hospital who says, I'm here for the dollar and I don't make that much. And that person will probably take off as much time as they can, and I would if I were them too. Then there are other custodians at that hospital who say, I'm part of the medical team. I put a fresh flower in front of a patient's face who's been in a coma for 3 months, just in case she ever wakes up, she'll see something beautiful. Or I read a book to a child who's dying of cancer every night because her parents never show up. How do you help people find purpose within any kind of job they might have? And that's really something that we as leaders should be trying to encourage and help figure out. So I think business leaders, if they can figure out how they can encourage that type of job crafting so people feel like they are part of a team, part of this bigger purpose, a purpose that's bigger than themselves. As I'd said in my talk, I think that people need that. They need it whether it's in their family, they need it whether it's in their religion, they need it whether it's in their government. But a very logical place is the place that most people spend most of their waking hours, which is called the occupation that they have. I think that one challenge in building a purpose-driven company, quite honestly, is leadership. That very often leaders may not understand the importance of having this type of purpose. Very often what leader is trained to understand the role and importance of purpose? Not many. Typically, that's a pretty radical leader. Typically, it's a person, at least at this point in time, who is a super leader, a super innovator, kind of sees this bigger picture of their company as an organism that could grow so much more if they had this overarching, transcending purpose. But within many organizations, you will have naysayers. You'll have people who go, well, how does that affect the bottom line? Is this going to cost us something? Will it divert? I mean, how many organizations in their C-suite have a purpose budget? There are budgets for learning and development now, which is cool. There's budgets for incoming new employees. There are budgets for all sorts of things. There's budgets for wellness or well-being. But is there a purpose budget? Is there a chief purpose officer? There are in some companies, but very few. One of my intentions is to help companies figure out how they can do this. And part of helping them figure it out is also getting some metrics of success. So one thing that Bob Chapman mentioned today in the meeting, he said, here's a metric of success, divorce rates. What a fascinating idea. Because we know that if you get a divorce, boy, you might be out then essentially in terms of productivity for 3-6 months or so. I mean, you're kind of whacked out for a while, no matter if it's a good divorce or not. If you lower the divorce rate by helping people become more purposeful at work, but then also having the energy to get home and be engaged with your spouse or partner, imagine what that could do for a company.
The meat of this series on higher purpose in business comes from the Organizational Higher Purpose Conference hosted by the Bauer Leadership Center at Washington University's Olin Business School in St. Louis last winter. On this second part of the series, we're going to hear about how a higher purpose in business can motivate people from Stuart Bunderson, the co-director of the Bauer Leadership Center, and then we'll learn about the physiology of purpose with more from Vic Strecher. And we're starting it off with Stuart Bunderson.
But let me start off with a little anecdote. This next slide summarizes a conversation that we had with an employee at an organization that shall remain nameless, and I'll tell you in just a minute who this is. But this is Amber Tetrick. And one of the questions we asked Amber was, tell us how you feel about your work here. And she says, I love this place. I'll be here until I retire, and then I'll volunteer again. That's impressive. I mean, wouldn't it be nice to have employees that kind of have that attitude? And then we asked another question. Okay, well then what would constitute grounds for divorce from this organization? If you feel so passionate about it, is there anything that would make you leave? Well, they'd have to fire me. She says, I think I like this place more than anybody else that works here. Okay, so now I put that little anecdote out. I've asked this a lot of people, okay, look at this and tell me, where do you think Amber works? So let me ask you that question. Tell me about the kind of organization that Amber works in. What do you think? Does she work for, maybe she works for Barry-Wehmiller. So actually, I asked this question to a lot of people, and here are the kind of answers that I get. Well, you know, probably works at a place like Google, right? All of our MBA students want to work at Google. And so I'm sure they work at Google, because the Google employees are probably, it's like playing every single day. Or maybe they work at like the hospital or Peace Corps or something like that. Good guesses, right? In other words, we're looking for some place that has this higher purpose and a wonderful place to work and they get paid a lot. Well, actually, Amber works in the insect house at the zoo. And let me tell you, so we asked Amber, okay, just for our benefit, describe what you do at the insect house at the zoo. And here's what she said: I raise bugs. You're collecting eggs, raising little insects, and when they get to be adults, you put them on display, and the adults on display die, and you go through every day to pick out dead ones and replace them with fresh ones. So this is awesome work, right? And yet this very person is saying, I would work here. They would have to fire me. There's nothing they could do that would get me to quit. So this obviously sort of raises questions about what really motivates people to work. There's a quote that I found several years ago by a guy named Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was a social activist, theologian. He said the following: people will work hard for money, they will work harder for other people, but people will work hardest of all when they are dedicated to a cause. Okay, let's unpack that. First, they will work hard for money. Here's these economic incentives: pay, benefits. They're also going to work harder. According to Fosdick, they will work harder for other people. And here we have another category of incentives. And I'm going to call these relational incentives. These are things like esteem, recognition, status, friendship. Now, we actually study these sorts of things in business schools. And people who study motivation spend a lot of time thinking about these sorts of things. But this next category we don't spend as much time on, and that's this sort of third idea of a cause. And we might call these ideological incentives, things like conviction, purpose, mission, and values, the kind of things that we're talking about here today. Well, so this is really a hypothesis. Fosdick is saying, you know, people are going to work hard for money, harder for other people, hardest of all when they're dedicated to a cause. Okay, well, can we test that hypothesis? So that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to find a place where we could explore this hypothesis, and so given our experience with people like Amber Tetrick, we said, okay, well, let's go to the zoo. Let me tell you about the zoo. Zookeeping lacks strong economic incentives. So the average income of a zookeeper is in the lowest quartile of U.S. occupations. Many zookeepers have to rely on another source of income in order to actually make ends meet. So clearly zookeepers are not working for Money. Zookeeping also lacks key relational and status incentives, things like prestige, opportunities for advancement. You don't really move up as a zookeeper, and it's often seen as dirty work. Most of what you're doing is, you're cleaning cages, cleaning feces. In fact, someone we talked to told us a story. Zookeeper's out cleaning her cage. School group comes by from the local Catholic school, and the nun turns to the kids and says, "Now, kids, this is the kind of job you get if you don't stay in school." And this was within earshot of the zookeeper, which is a little ironic because zookeepers are actually highly educated. Many have bachelor's or even master's degrees. So in spite of the fact that we don't have a lot of these sort of economic or relational incentives, zookeepers are highly committed. Many volunteer for months or years before getting hired. And then we heard things like this: "There's not much that they could do to get me to quit. I can't think what would cause me to leave. I don't think there's anything that they could do to me that would make me leave." Okay, so this is a level of commitment that is inexplicable if we assume that people work for economic or relational incentives, because those are not rich in zookeeping. And so what are they really working on? Well, that's what we wanted to understand. So we studied a whole bunch of zookeepers to find out, and the principal answer, the central theme that we found, speaks to the purpose of this conference, and it's a word that you've already heard several times today, and it's calling. Calling was a central theme. We heard things like this: "It's a calling for me. I knew this is what I was meant to do. It's kind of like my calling, I think. I found my little niche." Okay, so given that, we wanted to try and understand what do zookeepers mean by calling, and we dug into that a little bit. And let me tell you what we learned, and I think it's going to link back to some things that we've been talking about so far today. One of the things is the zookeeper's calling really has kind of two parts. And one part was this sense of personal identity. This is me. My particular gifts, talents, and passions are suited for this particular occupation. So we heard things like this: "It's a calling for me just because my whole life I've just been interested in animals. So looking back, I should have known at some time I would be working with animals. It's a part of who I am, and I don't know if I can explain that." When you use that expression, it's in your blood. Like football coaches and players can never retire because it's in their blood. Whatever my genetic makeup is, I'm geared toward animals. Okay, so there's one piece. I'm just the kind of person who does well with animals. But there's a second piece that has to be there before that sense of higher purpose that's embedded in calling really takes shape, and that's a societal need or problem, something out there in the world that needs resolution. And for zookeepers, it's the issue of species biodiversity. Animal species are disappearing throughout the world. Habitats are being destroyed. These are just two examples, but there are actually over 100,000 species, endangered species, on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List. So that's a lot of species, and so this is one problem. Zoos are helping to prevent extinction by caring for and breeding endangered species and by educating the public. And this is where zookeepers fit in. Zookeepers help by caring for those animals and by supporting breeding and education efforts. So in other words, the calling that we're hearing these zookeepers, this is my calling. This is why I put up with low pay. This is why I put up with the fact that there's no progression. This is low status and dirty work. Well, it's because this is really my calling, because I'm sort of this sort of person. I'm an animal person, and there's a need in the world that my unique skill set can address, and that's where I find my place. And we hear people saying things like this: "My little way of preserving what we have left is taking care of these animals." But it's a little more complicated than just saying, "Okay, great, wonderful. I found my calling. These are my gifts and talents. There's a problem. It fits. Calling. This is my contribution. Every day is blissful." That's actually not what we found. It's actually the consequences of having this higher calling, this purpose that is motivating these zookeepers, was actually kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it clearly gave them a sense of meaning. And that's the thing about this job, is anything I do is ultimately for the animals, even if it's scrubbing down the back hallways. It transforms scrubbing down the back hallways from a menial task to something that's maybe an offering. This is something that I'm doing that's making a difference in animal preservation. But at the same time, there's this sense, okay, if I'm that kind of person, there's a need in the world, I really have to do it. If I don't do it, who's going to do it? And so there's this obligation and a sense that I have to sacrifice. So we hear zookeepers saying things like this: "The animals never chose to be here. and it's our responsibility to come in and give them the care that they need and make sure that they're healthy and happy, I make as much as someone at McDonald's does. I'm certainly not doing it for the money. So we found that this work of a zookeeper and having a calling was really a double-edged sword. In fact, we had a survey that we distributed to zookeepers throughout the US and Canada, over almost 1,000 zookeepers. We found that those people who reported a higher sense of calling were much more likely to find their work as being meaningful. But at the same time, they also had some burdens associated with that. They were more likely to say, my work is a moral duty. They were more likely to say they had to sacrifice for their work and they needed to be willing to sacrifice for their work. And I think this brings up a really important point that we need to grapple with as we're having this conversation about purpose, which is that purpose is not the same thing as happiness. Meaning and meaningfulness is not the same thing as happiness. There's been a lot of research on happiness or subjective well-being, which people often define as being generally positive and satisfied with your life. That's how researchers typically define the concept of happiness. Meaning is something a little different, feeling that one's life has purpose and value. And these things are not the same, and they're not predicted by the same things. In fact, there's one study that I really liked by Baumeister and some colleagues that found that connecting to other people makes you happier and gives you a stronger sense of meaning. Awesome. Satisfying your needs and wants makes you happier, doesn't necessarily give you more meaning in your life or work. Being free from cares and stress, yeah, I'm happier. Subjective well-being doesn't necessarily give you higher meaning. And then there are some things that actually work opposite. Sacrificing yourself for others actually makes you less happy, but increases meaning and meaningfulness in your life. So this is the parent of young children effect, right? I mean, you ask them, and in all the surveys that are done, parents of young children tend to report lower levels of happiness, but people aren't always asking in those surveys, but is it meaningful for you? Do you find meaning in your life because of what you're doing? Sacrificing yourself for others might make you less happy, but it increases meaning. Thinking beyond the present actually decreases happiness while increasing meaning, and experiencing difficulties in life decreases happiness, but makes you realize and focus on those things that are most meaningful. So zookeepers are opting for meaning and not happiness. If they were focused on this subjective well-being, they might go find a job that paid more and that didn't require that they shovel manure every day out in the cold and in the weather. But they have chosen something that gives them a sense of meaning. So let me just return to this starting quote. Fosdick said that people work hard for money, harder for other people, but hardest of all when they're dedicated to a cause. Well, let's see if we can test that hypothesis in the zoo. So we asked directors of the zoo to tell us which of your zookeepers are most willing to sacrifice and are most devoted to their jobs. Who are your exemplary employees? And then we looked to see, okay, is it pay? And we found that actually the more highly paid the zookeepers were, the less likely they were to be nominated by their directors as being exemplary employees. Now this was not significant, so we probably shouldn't make a lot of it, but it is interesting that the trend is negative. Well, how about for other people? Well, we asked people, the extent to which they feel like they're a part of the family at the zoo, and we did find that those people who said that they feel more like part of the family were more likely to be nominated by their directors as exemplary employees. But it wasn't a significant difference. And then we looked at calling, and we did find that those employees, those zookeepers that reported this strong sense of calling were actually more likely to be nominated by their directors as being exemplary. So, final point. Okay, this is zookeeping. Is it just zookeeping? We're going to find it in the Peace Corps, hospitals, education, but we're not going to find it in management. Well, we did actually ask different samples from different settings to what extent they felt like their work was a calling. Zookeepers are really up there, right? Over 90% of zookeepers are saying that they feel like their work is a calling, but let's now go to management professionals. They're right at about 50%. So about half of the management professionals in our study did say their work feels like a calling, which, is the glass half empty or half full? I mean, we could sort of grapple with that. That means 50% don't, but it means 50% do, and it also means that it's possible within the management profession to find that sense of calling and feel like my gifts and talents are matched with some problem out there in the world that I'm working to solve.
Thanks. Hi. Yeah, I'm in a school of public health, not a school of business. I'm also in a medical school, and a lot of my work has been fairly quantitative, looking at individuals' purpose. And I've been fascinated by the idea of organizational purposes and how the two could connect. So that's something that I'd like to talk about just a little bit. A good friend of mine, Ari Weinswag, who's also a good friend of Bob Quinn's, who is one of the founders of Zingerman's Deli, which is a little hole-in-the-wall deli now. It's a $55 million a year company, uses this analogy, which I like a lot, and he refers to a Harris poll that says that roughly 37% of employees clearly know their company's purpose. We've talked a lot about disengagement. This certainly reflects that. 20% are enthusiastic about their purpose. 20% see how they could support the purpose of their organization. 15% feel enabled to work toward their purpose. And 20% fully trust the company that employs them. So Ari goes on and says, well, what if that were a football team? That, by the way, is Tom Brady, made famous by the University of Michigan, of course. And so what if Tom were in a huddle with his 11 players, and 4 of them knew which goal they were going toward, and 2 of them cared, and 2 of them knew which position they're supposed to be playing, and 2 believed that their efforts would make any difference, and 8 would just soon be rooting for the other team? Of course, we'd find that completely illogical and ridiculous, but we don't seem to be so concerned about that in the places that we spend most of our waking hours, the workplace. So, you know, it's funny, we were talking about suicide, and in the last 10 years, students' suicidal ideation around 180 college campuses around the United States. Suicidal ideation. Have you thought about, seriously considered taking your own life in the last 12 months? That's a question. It's doubled in the last 10 years, doubled. It's now up to 13% of all college students. And it's super related to whether they feel they have a purpose. Incredibly related. Over 3 times as many people with a lower purpose feel that's the case. Now, over 100 years ago, a guy named Emile Durkheim, our father of modern sociology, actually wrote a book about this, because throughout France and throughout Europe, people were starting to kill themselves. And he said, what's going on? And he kind of thought it's because of alienation and ennui, a deadening of life, because we're moving from places like little villages around France into central locations where we're engaged in manufacturing and industrial revolution type of work, and we're not feeling like we're a part of anything anymore. In fact, he said, if you read his book, Suicide, which is really an amazing book to read, but if you go to the very end, he starts asking this question, like, what is it that's really going to help people in France and throughout Europe? And he says he must feel himself more in solidarity with a collective existence which precedes him in time, which survives him, and then which encompasses him at all points. If this occurs, he'll no longer find the only aim of his conduct in himself, and understanding that he is an instrument of a purpose greater than himself. In other words, a transcending purpose, what we've been talking about early this morning. But then he asked this great question. He said, where should we get this purpose? You know, what group should we align with? And he said, you know, not political society. And he was looking at France at that time. He said, political society is not going to do this. He said, not even religious society, because in France and throughout Europe, we're kind of losing our religion to some extent. We need something beyond religion, or in addition to religion, he was saying. Not even the family, because we're leaving our families in the villages to go into Lyon and Paris and other places to work all the time. He said, beside the society of faith, of family, of politics, there is one other of which no mention has been made, the occupational group or corporation. And he was a friggin' communist. So, I mean, this is amazing for a socialist communist to say, wow, we should start looking at the corporations. So let's take a look at what happens when you do have purpose. And this is something that I do study and publish in and work with a pretty broad variety of different kinds of researchers now.
If you have a strong purpose in life, and let's just define that. I define that as a goal or set of goals around things that matter most to people. And we've seen different definitions, but a good question in this typically is, I have a strong sense of purpose and direction in my life. And if you do, you're able to plunge your arm in ice water and hold it in longer than if you have no sense or a weaker sense of purpose. Your DNA is repaired more. Our telomeres, the ends of our chromosomes, which repair our DNA, literally are longer, and there's more telomerase. The fuel, the enzyme that fuels our telomeres, is more apparent in our blood, is at higher levels in our blood if we improve our purpose. This is discovered by the 2009 Nobel laureate in medicine, Elizabeth Blackburn, who discovered the role of telomeres. People live longer. You can't make this go away. There are 5 studies that have shown longitudinally people with a strong purpose in life live longer. They sleep better. By the way, they have better sex and they make more money. Those are the side effects of having a purpose. Better sex and more money. Imagine a drug that did all of these things and they said, oh yeah, but this is where the side effects are. Yeah, you might have better sex and make more money over time. Yeah, right, have higher net worth. Why is that? I'll get to that in just a second. People have less fear response. People with a transcending purpose have less pro-inflammatory gene expression. I'll repeat that. People with a self-transcending purpose have less pro-inflammatory gene expression. Pro-inflammatory cells kill us. They cause heart disease, they cause many cancers, they cause kidney disease, and they also, people with a transcending purpose have more antibody production. We want antibodies. We don't want so many pro-inflammatory cells circulating around our body. People with a self-enhancing or hedonic purpose have the opposite. They have more pro-inflammatory cell production and they have less antibody production. There's a big study, a beautiful study in Japan of technology employees finding exactly this. That was replicated twice here in the United States. I could go on and on about these, but this is pretty amazing. At retirement, if you can't repurpose your life, you are 2.4 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease 7 years later. There are now 3 studies that have shown this. This is controlling for the kitchen sink: age, race, gender, income, education, health status, cognitive impairment, health behaviors. You cannot get rid of this. People with a strong purpose just simply do better. We could get into mechanisms in questions later if you're interested. People who are put on a slope of 14.5 degrees and blindfolded estimate that slope on average to be 31 degrees. There are a couple of studies of this. They typically double the slope. If you add 25 pounds of dead weight on a backpack to them, they estimate that same slope to be 42 degrees. If you put that 25-pound backpack in with this electric fan that goes whirring around, and they tell that person, you have important scientific equipment in your backpack. This is incredibly important to science, to mankind, to humanity in general. They re-estimate the slope to be what the control group did. In other words, purpose actually levels mountains. It's a very important point. If you are doing a job interview, like a job pitch, to a hostile audience who is trained to be hostile and they're starting to harumph around, things like that. If you have a weak purpose, your cortisol level goes up and it doesn't go down for quite a long time. If you have a strong purpose in your life, it goes up and then it recovers faster. People with a higher purpose have faster recovery. They don't have less cortisol peak. In other words, they're still getting just as stressed out as anyone else, but it recovers faster, and that's really key. Making sense so far? So, fair amount of studies I'm throwing at you. I'll throw in 1 or 2 others. We love to put people into MRI. Anyone been in an MRI before? Claustrophobic, big clanking noise, right? Well, we make it worse. We clamp their head down. We put these little video cameras in front of their face, and we give them little joysticks to rate things, and then we study lots of parts of the brain. One part that's not up here is a part of the brain related to conflict. People with a strong purpose have less activation in the part of the brain that relates to conflict. Why? Because I know what to do. I have a purpose. I'm not conflicted. I know exactly what to do. So those people also sleep better, by the way, in our research. So 2 parts of the brain we're really interested in is this amygdala, this reptilian part of our brain. By the way, this is over 100 million years old. Dinosaurs had amygdala. T-Rexes had amygdala. The fear and aggression part of our brain, super, super primal. And then we have this part of the brain that we call the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, part of the prefrontal cortex, superhuman part of the brain. Relates, I like to call it the guru part of the brain because it relates to executive decision-making and functioning. It also relates to self-identity. So we love to put people into MRI and show them pictures like this. And this is the nicest picture that we show, I can guarantee it. I could show you other pictures, I'd never show them to you after breakfast. I mean, I have to clean up all the barf. So we show them scary pictures intended purposely to increase activity in this amygdala, this fear center. And sure enough, just shooting blood into the amygdala. It's starting to get super active. And that's important. At the same time, though, what we find is that the prefrontal cortex, this guru brain, shrinks in activity at the same time. It's because, you only have a certain amount of resources. By the way, the brain is 2% of our body. That brain absorbs 20% of our energy. So there's only, it's really utilizing a lot of energy, and all the energy is going into this fear center and aggression center when you show them really, really horrific pictures or scare them in general. You know that. When you see a horror movie, if somebody cuts you off on the highway, the first thing you do is a shudder like that, and that's the amygdala going off. Now, the real question is what happens afterwards. Within seconds, a resilient person has their amygdala shrink back down, in fact, less in size than it was originally, and the prefrontal cortex gets more activation than ever. Now imagine Tom Brady having his head smashed into the turf by some linebacker who's dancing over him now, and he's going, oh my God, and his amygdala is going crazy, and then he gets up and goes, what was that defense again? This is the neurosignature of resilience, and not everybody has it. Elite athletes tend to have it, Navy SEALs tend to have it, many, many people who are super productive in business tend to have this bounce, but not everybody has it. And that's a really important thing that we like to study. This is really a neurosignature of what we're talking about. So what we then do is put people into MRI and we ask them to think about their purpose. So we say, what are the things that matter most to you? What are you like when you're at your best? What is your purpose? Things like that. And as we have them start thinking about it, more blood flow goes to the prefrontal cortex, our guru brain, and less blood flow goes to the amygdala. So if you view these parts of the brain, which is essentially, the consistency of tofu, but if you view the parts of the brain as muscles, we're kind of working out those muscles. So the next question is, can we make people more purposeful? What happens? And then the bigger question is, what kind of purposes do people have? Are all purposes the same? I already said that, self-transcending purposes are probably much better for you. So in other words, when you think about things bigger than yourself, you do better yourself. Oddly enough, as Raj Sisodia and others have found, when your company has a purpose bigger than just revenue, it makes more revenue. There's something Zen-like about this, isn't it? Like the more you think about things bigger than itself, the better you do yourself. But we've explored, I also have a company called Kumanu, and Kumanu is Maori for nourish and cherish. And I build apps. I've built over 100 apps in my life, and one of the apps we built recently is called Purposeful. So in this app, we've collected purposes from over 19,000, now 20,000 people. So we have 20,000 purposes. So what do you do with all this 20,000 purposes? And we ask people, what's your purpose at work? What's your purpose at home, in your community, in your personal life? And so taking a look, and I'll show you how we do it. So we start by just saying, what picture, image represents your purpose? Like some of the most important things in your life. And this is my granddaughter, Madeline. And so I said, yeah, Madeline matters a lot. So I pop that in and can rotate to other pictures. But there's also this purpose quest finder in life and at work. So I put my purpose in there after this 7-step program that we have. And you can see it yourself. My purpose, to enjoy love and beauty. That's a personal purpose. To be an engaged husband, father, son, and grandfather. That is a family purpose. To teach every student as if they're my own daughter, Julia. So my daughter, Julia, passed away 10 years ago, very suddenly of a heart attack, very unexpectedly. When that happened, I kind of lost my own purpose. And I remember I was out it was funny. I was 2 weeks after my daughter died. I was asked to give a talk at an occupational medicine conference. And this occupational med doc, to a lot of employers, and he was saying, okay, if you get sick, this kind of illness, or this kind of illness, or this kind of illness, you lose this amount of productivity, this many hours in productivity, et cetera. And he said, if your spouse gets sick, this is what happens. And then if you lose a parent, this is how much loss of productivity. If you lose a spouse, oh, that's a lot. You lose this amount of productivity. And then he stopped and he said, but if you lose a child, you never become productive again. And I was the next speaker. And I wanted to say, but I didn't, because I'm polite and from the Midwest, like you guys are. So we wouldn't say something like that. But I sure felt like it. But I had to ask myself, am I going to lose my productivity? Am I really going to become completely disabled for the rest of my life because of this? Because I sure as hell was feeling that way. And I decided to try to repurpose my life by teaching every one of my students as if they're my own child, Julia. And that completely changed my life. It completely turned around my work life. I started diving into work with a purpose that was bigger than I even had before, and that's been very helpful. My other purpose is to help over 1 billion people find a transcending purpose and direction in their lives. So we ask people, what are you like when you're at your best at work? And then we create a word cloud of the people at that job or within that section of a company. We say, okay, well, this is, by the way, the word cloud of Kumano, our company, which has 25 people and software engineers and AI people and a lot of other people. So you can see what we do, that type of thing. When we look at these 19,000 purposes, we see a lot of words and a lot of phrases. Now what we've been doing is using artificial intelligence and what's called natural language processing. So we take these phrases that people use, we map them to a Google lexicon, and using artificial intelligence, we actually start saying, okay, are there certain typologies or connections or patterns of these words that are used when people cite their purpose at work? Is this making sense? So we're using a fair amount of machine learning and artificial intelligence to do this. We also have to have people just looking at it going, okay, let's think about this. Okay, does that make sense? And then we train the system that way too. But it's not unlike Moneyball, for the St. Louis Cardinals. Yeah, awesome, okay. So what we've done then is find 6 different typologies. And I'm not saying this is like the end of this. This is the beginning game. There's a lot more to do, and any of you quantitative business school professors who want to work with us, boy, we are all over that. Or doctoral students or anybody if you're into this. But this is one purpose. And by the way, this is how our book of business looks, and we have like Stanford University and Booz Allen Hamilton and many other big companies involved with us. And so one is like we have people saying, I'm into the company, and they mention the company all the time. We have others who really talk a lot about their team and their coworkers. And that makes a lot of sense. In fact, that's the majority of our book of business. And because they don't see the bigger company purpose, and they couldn't even recite the company's purpose, but they're totally into helping their team out, which is awesome. There are people interested in personal growth. That's a super important part. I'm here to make myself better, to learn more, to improve. Then there are people who are advancers. So think about how to succeed at business without trying, that musical. This is Matthew Broderick. I am climbing up the ladder as fast as I can. Never mention the company, never mention the team. And I'm not saying this is bad. I'm not casting any aspersions to this. These people tend to be younger. They tend to have unbelievable amounts of stress. They tend to sleep horribly. So for every one of these typologies, we're starting to build out basically a persona around them. What are the things, the issues they need the most? How would we approach this person? Because if we're just saying everyone should be more purposeful, does that mean everyone's somehow going to magically be the company, have the company purpose in mind? Maybe that's good. Maybe you fire the people who don't. Maybe you only hire the people who do. That's what I'd like to discuss a little later with Stuart and others. I think that'll be awesome. So advancers, and then there are providers. These are people who mention their paycheck, mention money all the time, mention I'm doing this for my family, or I'm doing it to ski in Aspen. I want to hang out with Bob Chapman more. So whatever. So they're talking about money pretty much. And you could see how different companies would have different distributions of these kinds of typologies. And finally, there's a group that Maslow called transcenders. Maslow, at the end of his life, after he kept talking about self-actualization, Viktor Frankl came to him, had gone through 3 concentration camps, Man's Search for Meaning, said, that's not the peak. I think the peak is self-transcendence, where you're thinking about things bigger than yourself, not just your own actualization and your performance and your, all of those great things that the me generation was interested in, and it's something bigger than that. It's transcendence. And Maslow, the most famous, humanistic psychologist, father of that, in the 60s, he said, "You're right. You're right. I didn't even think that way." And Maslow spent the rest of his career, the next 10 years of his career, studying transcenders in organizations. And he found that these people were somewhat rare, but they tended to be the innovators and the connectors in the organization. They tended to have like this super purpose that also inspired other people. So if you can find these people, or if you could grow that group of people, you don't want everyone to be a transcender maybe, who knows? But you could see a certain case mix. You don't want everybody to be a wide receiver on your team, right? But you want some people to be awesome within that team who are transcending even the company, to do things bigger than the company.
Thanks for listening to the Everybody Matters podcast. If you'd like to find out more about Bob Chapman and Ross Zodia's book, Everybody Matters, The Extraordinary Power of Caring for Your People Like Family, go to everybodymattersbook.com. For updates on the book, this podcast, a lot of great content and insight. Don't forget to connect with us on the web at Barry-Wehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stuart. Thanks for listening. And don't forget, Everybody Matters is the only business idea with truly unlimited potential.